I was peeling sweet potatoes when the phone rang. The sun had just started to sink behind the oaks outside my window, throwing gold light across the counter. For a second, I thought maybe it was one of those scam calls I could ignore, but when I saw her name on the screen, my heart stuttered. My daughter never called this early, or at all lately. "Hi, baby," I said, trying to sound cheerful, even though my voice came out thinner than I hoped. There was a pause, that kind of heavy pause that means bad news is coming. Then she said it, just 4 words that made the knife slip in my hand. "Don't come for Thanksgiving." At first, I thought she was joking. Maybe she was planning a surprise, or maybe her house was too full this year. I laughed, a small, shaky laugh, waiting for her to join me. But all I heard was her breathing on the other end of the line. "Mama," she said softly, like she was about to explain something important. "It's just better this way. You know how things get." Better this way. My throat went dry. I wanted to ask, better for who? But I swallowed the words. I didn't want her to hear the crack in my voice. Instead, I just said, "Of course, honey. You do what you need to." When the line went dead, I just stood there. The smell of cinnamon and butter from the pie crust filled the kitchen, but it suddenly felt like an empty room. I stared at the phone for a long time, hoping maybe she'd call back. She didn't. I sat down at the kitchen table, the one her father built with his own hands 40 years ago. Every scratch on it was a memory. Birthdays, report cards, first boyfriends, and arguments that always ended with a hug. I ran my hand over the wood, tracing the grain like I was tracing my past. It wasn't the first time she'd pushed me away, but this time felt final. Last Christmas, she sent a card without a return address. On my birthday, she texted 3 words, "Hope you're well." That was all. I told myself she was just busy. New house, new husband, new life. But deep down, I knew. Something had been broken between us for a long time. I looked at the half-peeled potatoes on the counter and felt ridiculous. I had been planning the same menu for weeks. Cornbread stuffing, roasted turkey, sweet potato casserole with marshmallows on top, just like she liked when she was little. I could almost hear her voice saying, "More marshmallows, Mama, pile them up." Tears burned behind my eyes. I grabbed a dish towel and wiped them away before they could fall. It felt childish to cry over a holiday, but it wasn't just a meal I was losing. It was my place in her life, my chair at her table, my right to be called Mama in a house that used to echo with it. I walked to the living room and turned on the lamp beside her old piano. The light caught a family photo on the shelf, her wedding day. She stood beside her husband, beaming, while the pastor placed his hand on their shoulders in blessing. I was smiling too, though I remember now how forced that smile felt. That day was the beginning of the distance between us, and standing there, staring at that picture, I finally let myself admit it. Something happened that day, something we never talked about, something that started with a prayer and ended with silence. The word Thanksgiving used to mean gratitude, family, faith, but that night, it sounded like rejection, like a locked door. And as I turned off the kitchen light, I whispered into the dark, "I'm still thankful for you, baby, even if you don't want me there." The next morning, the house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed against your chest and made your own heartbeat sound loud. I tried to fill it with noise, turned on the radio, hummed along to old gospel songs, but nothing could drown the echo of her words. "Don't come for Thanksgiving." I went to the pantry and pulled out my recipe book. It was the same one I'd had since my first Thanksgiving as a wife. Butter stains on every other page, notes in the margins from years of trial and error. The handwriting changed over time, younger and neater in the beginning, more crooked and tired toward the end. Each smudge told a story, and so did each name scribbled in the corners. My mother's, my husband's, my daughter's. Family recipes weren't just food, they were proof that we belonged to one another. I ran my fingers over the page for sweet potato pie, the same one my daughter used to beg me to make twice a year. The words blurred as my eyes filled. I could almost hear her laugh, that girlish ringing sound that always filled the kitchen back when her world was small enough to fit between these walls. Back then, she would sit on the counter, swinging her legs while I cooked. She'd ask endless questions about love, about God, about why the world could be both cruel and beautiful. I'd tell her that kindness was a choice, that faith was a comfort, and love was a promise you had to renew every day. She'd listen, wide-eyed, as if every word was a secret meant just for her. But something changed after her father passed. Grief settled in our home like dust. soft, invisible, everywhere. She was 16, angry at everything, especially at me. I tried to keep her in church, tried to remind her that God was still good. But she wanted to run, to college, to freedom, to anyone who wasn't me. The pastor tried to help. I thought he did. I never guessed how his comfort would cost us both. I remember the night before her wedding. I stayed up hemming her dress, humming the same hymn I sang when she was born. The pastor came by to drop off some papers, and we talked in the living room while she was out with her friends. He told me how proud he was of her, how much she'd grown in her faith. But there was something in his eyes, something that made me uneasy. A shadow of pity, maybe, or guilt. On the day of the wedding, when he asked if anyone objected, I held my breath. Not because I wanted to stop it, but because I felt something shift inside me, like God himself was watching a lie unfold and waiting for me to speak. But I didn't. I smiled for the cameras, I clapped for the vows, and I swallowed my doubt like medicine. Now, years later, sitting alone in that same house, I wondered what would have happened if I had spoken up. If I had asked her why she suddenly stopped calling after the honeymoon, or why the pastor stopped visiting the congregation altogether. The silence between us grew roots, thick and tangled, and neither of us had the courage to cut them away. I got up and dusted the shelves, rearranged the same old photos, her first day of school, her prom night, the picture where her father held her like she was the whole world. My heart ached with the memory of the man who used to say, "She's stubborn like you, Ruth. One day she'll come around." He'd always believed in reconciliation. He'd always believed in grace. But grace, I'd learned, was harder than faith. You could pray for it every day and still not feel worthy of it, especially when the person you were praying for wanted nothing to do with you. The light outside dimmed. I stood by the window, watching leaves fall onto the porch. Each one seemed to whisper something I couldn't quite hear. I closed the curtains and said aloud, "You may not want me there, baby, but I'll still make my pie. Maybe one day, you'll remember how it tasted." And that night, as I slid the pie into the oven, I made another decision. One I hadn't dared to make in years. I would go see her. And I wouldn't go alone. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, memories flooded in, thick and heavy as smoke. The church bells from long ago seemed to echo through my mind, that familiar Sunday sound that once meant comfort, now only stirring up regret. I thought of the old chapel, with its worn pews and sunlight slanting through colored glass. That's where everything started, and where everything went wrong. Back then, Pastor James was new to our little town, young, kind, the kind of man who made everyone feel seen. He had a way of speaking that made you believe hope was a tangible thing, something you could hold in your hand if you just reached far enough. My daughter adored him from the start, not in a way that was wrong, but in the way a lost soul adores someone who listens. When her father died, she turned to him for counsel. I encouraged it at first. I was too consumed by my own grief to see the danger of leaning too much on one person. The pastor was there for both of us, but especially for her. He'd bring her books about forgiveness, sit with her after service, talk to her about her future. I thought it was healing. I thought God had sent him to guide her. But something shifted one afternoon. I stopped by the church to drop off flowers for Sunday service, and I heard voices from the office. My daughter's voice, sharp, trembling, his low, soothing. I froze outside the door. I shouldn't have listened, but I did. She said, "I can't do this anymore. She's suffocating me." And he answered, "You have to let go of her control. You're not a child anymore." My heart splintered. I wanted to burst in to remind them both that love and control were not the same thing. But instead, I backed away, my hand over my mouth, shaking. That night, I prayed harder than I had in years. I asked God to show me the truth, to help me understand what was happening to my family. But all I got was silence. A silence that grew louder each week. When my daughter announced she was marrying a man she'd met through the church, I thought it was sudden, too sudden. Pastor James officiated, of course. He smiled through the ceremony, but I noticed how his hands trembled when he held the Bible. I noticed how he couldn't quite meet my eyes. After the wedding, my daughter stopped coming to service. She said she wanted a new start, a new congregation closer to her husband's family. Pastor James resigned not long after, said he was moving to another county. The same week, I received a letter from my daughter, short, formal, ending with the line, "Please don't call me for a while. I need space." I never told anyone about that letter or about what I overheard. For years, I kept it folded in my Bible, tucked between Psalms and Proverbs like a wound hidden behind scripture. I convinced myself that whatever sin had been committed, it wasn't mine to expose. But silence is a sin too, and I'd been carrying mine like a cross. That's why, when she told me not to come for Thanksgiving, something inside me snapped. Not in anger, but in resolve. I couldn't spend another holiday pretending we were fine. I couldn't keep worshiping a memory of peace that never existed. So before the sun rose, I put on my coat and drove toward the church, the same one where everything had fallen apart. I didn't know what I was going to say or do, only that it was time. Time to face the man who'd once preached forgiveness and somehow forgotten how to live it. As I parked in front of the chapel, I saw him through the window, setting up for morning prayer, his hair grayer now, his back more bent. He looked older, heavier with time and guilt. My reflection in the glass met his across the years, and as I reached for the door handle, one thought pulsed through me. This time, he will answer. The church smelled just the same, wood polish and candle wax, faintly sweet and holy. My heels clicked softly against the floor as I stepped inside. Pastor James looked up from the altar, startled, the silver chalice still in his hand. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of 10 years settled between us like dust, thick with everything we never said. "Ruth," he said finally, my name catching awkwardly on his tongue. "I didn't expect it." "I'm sure you didn't," interrupted, setting my purse on the pew. "Seems we're both better at avoiding things than facing them." My voice was steady, but my heart was hammering against my ribs. Every sound in the sanctuary, the creak of the pew, the echo of our breathing, seemed too loud, too alive. He sighed, put down the chalice, and wiped his hands on a cloth. His shoulders were slumped, his voice quieter than I remembered. "You shouldn't have come all this way. It's been a long time. 10 years, to be exact." I took a seat. "You married my daughter, Pastor James. You blessed her vows, her home, her life, and now she's told me I'm not welcome in any of it. You think that's a coincidence?" His lips parted, but no words came. He looked down at the Bible in front of him, his fingers trembling as they brushed the worn cover. "She made her own choices, Ruth. We all did. You can't rewrite what's already been done." "Did we make choices?" I asked softly, "or did we let fear make them for us?" For a long moment, only the clock ticked. Outside, rain began to patter against the windows, slow at first, then harder, like the sky itself was listening in on our conversation. He sat beside me, the pew creaking under our combined weight. "What do you want from me?" he asked, not unkindly. There was a tremor in his voice that told me he already knew. "I want you to come with me," I said simply, "to her house, for Thanksgiving." He blinked, stunned. "Ruth, that's unthinkable." "Maybe, but maybe that's the point." I leaned forward. "You said once that truth is the highest form of grace. I think it's time you proved it." He ran a hand over his face, exhaling like a man cornered by his own conscience. "She won't forgive me, or you. There's too much." "Then let her be angry," I cut in. "But let her hear the truth from the two people who've hidden it the longest. I'm tired of carrying ghosts to dinner. This year, I want to bring something real." He looked at me for a long time, his eyes softening the way they used to when he was still a shepherd to his flock. There was pity in them, but also something like relief. "You've always been stubborn," he said with a faint smile. "I see where she gets it." "She gets her faith from you," I said, surprising myself with the gentleness in my tone, even if it broke her heart. His eyes dropped to the floor. "I was trying to protect her. From you. From the anger between you two. I thought space would help her heal." "And did it?" I asked. Because from where I stand, all that distance just turned into silence. He didn't answer. The silence stretched long enough for me to hear the faint drip of rainwater from the roof. Finally, he nodded slowly, as if surrendering to something greater than either of us. "All right. If it's grace you're asking for, maybe it's time I stopped running from it." I rose, smoothing my coat, my heart pounding with equal parts fear and relief. "Dinner starts at 4. I'll pick you up at 3. He chuckled weakly, shaking his head. "You really mean to do this?" "I do," I said, "and this time no one's telling me I can't come." He smiled sadly. a pastor's smile that carried the weight of both blessing and regret. Then I'll be ready. Maybe it's time we all sit at the same table again. When I left the church, the sky was turning gray, heavy with rain. I tightened my scarf and took one last look at the steeple. The bells began to ring in the distance, low and solemn, echoing through the town like a warning and a promise all at once. For the first time in years, I felt something like peace. Not because I was certain of what would happen, but because I'd finally stopped being afraid of it. In the distance, the wind carried the faint sound of a hymn. Amazing Grace. The same one he'd sung at her wedding. I smiled to myself and whispered, maybe this time it'll mean what it's supposed to. As I walked away, the rain broke open in earnest, soaking through my coat. But I didn't rush. Let it fall, I thought. Let it wash away what's left of the past. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of rain tapping against my window like impatient fingers. The air was thick and gray, and the cold seemed to slip beneath the cracks of the house, curling around my ankles as I moved through the rooms. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd done, about what I'd asked of him. Part of me expected Pastor James to call and say he couldn't come, that it was too much too soon. But the phone stayed silent, and the silence, somehow, hurt more than a refusal would have. I spent the morning pacing, cleaning things that didn't need cleaning. The pie dishes were already washed, the floors mopped, but I still moved like a woman trying to scrub away nerves. Every time I passed the clock, the sound of its ticking seemed to grow louder, marking each second of doubt that crept up on me. Around noon, I couldn't take it anymore. I picked up the phone and called him. It rang longer than I expected before his voice came through, low and tired. Ruth. Just my name, nothing more, but it carried a weight that made me sit down at once. Are you still coming? I asked. My voice cracked on the word still, betraying how much hope was tangled up in it. He sighed on the other end. I could almost hear the rustle of papers, maybe the sound of his coat brushing the wall. I haven't decided, he said. I didn't sleep last night. I kept thinking about your daughter, about that day. So did I whispered. He didn't speak for a while. Then he said, you think she'll listen to us after all this time? I thought of my daughter's face, the way her eyes used to light up when she laughed, and how they hardened the last time she looked at me. Maybe she won't, admitted, but truth doesn't wait for permission. The line went quiet again, then softly. You always did believe in the hard kind of grace. Someone had to, I said. He gave a dry chuckle, but it sounded more like a sigh. You know, I left that church thinking I could outrun what happened. I told myself I was protecting her, from gossip, from scandal, from you. But I think I was just protecting myself. You were a good man once, I said. Maybe you still are, but hiding from truth doesn't make it disappear. It just makes it grow teeth. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, if I go with you, Ruth, she'll see me as the reason you two fell apart. She already does, I said quietly. But if you stay away, she'll never know the whole story, and I can't carry your silence anymore, not on a day meant for giving thanks. There was a soft sound, maybe a chair creaking, and then a weary sigh. You know, he said slowly, you've always had a way of turning guilt into courage. I learned that from you, I replied, from your sermons about second chances. You said grace wasn't just about being forgiven. It was about being brave enough to tell the truth. That made him pause. I could hear him breathing steady but heavy. Finally, he said, if I come, I'll need to say everything, even the part that will hurt you. I expect nothing less, I said. Pain doesn't scare me anymore. There was another long silence before he whispered, all right, Ruth. I'll be ready at 3. When I hung up, I sat there for a moment, staring at the wall, trying to steady my heart. Outside, the rain began to lighten, turning to a mist. I pressed my hand to the window and watched the droplets slide down like tiny rivers. Maybe it was foolish what I was about to do. Maybe it would break us all over again. But maybe, just maybe, it would also heal something. At 2:30, I put on my best coat, the blue one with the pearl buttons, and wrapped a scarf around my neck. I packed the pie in a box, covered it carefully with foil, and set it on the seat beside me. When I turned the key in the ignition, the car coughed, hesitated, then started with a growl. Just like me, I thought. Stubborn, old, but still moving. As I drove toward the parsonage, I rehearsed what I might say to my daughter, how I might start, but every word felt too small for the years between us. By the time I reached his house, my hands were shaking. Pastor James was standing on the porch when I pulled up, his coat buttoned, his Bible clutched in one hand. He looked like a man walking to his own confession. When he saw me, he managed a faint smile, one that barely reached his eyes. "Ready?" I asked through the window. He nodded slowly, "As I'll ever be." And as he climbed into the passenger seat, I thought, maybe this is what redemption looks like. Not grand or glorious, but two tired souls driving into the storm together. The rain had slowed by the time we reached the edge of my daughter's neighborhood, but the sky still looked bruised. Streaks of gray and purple folding into one another like an old wound, refusing to close. Pastor James sat in silence beside me, hands clasped tightly over his Bible, his knuckles white. The wiper swept back and forth, keeping rhythm with my heartbeat. Every few seconds, I caught myself holding my breath. As we turned onto her street, the houses glowed softly in the early evening light. Wreaths of orange leaves hung on doors, and strings of fairy lights blinked in the windows. The smell of wood smoke curled through the damp air. It was the kind of neighborhood meant for peace, for family. I felt like an intruder just driving through it. When her house came into view, my chest tightened. It looked the same as always. White shutters, brick porch, the little wind chime I'd given her years ago still hanging by the door. It tinkled faintly as the breeze picked up, like a ghost remembering a song. Through the window, I could see movement, silhouettes at the table, laughter, light. She had company. "She's not alone," Pastor James said quietly, watching the shadows. "Looks like her husband's family." I nodded, my throat thick. "They always come early. Her mother-in-law likes to make the gravy herself." He gave a tight smile. "Some traditions never die." I parked by the curb, killed the engine, and for a long time, neither of us moved. The ticking of the cooling motor filled the silence. My fingers rested on the pie box beside me, tracing the edges as if steadying myself on something familiar. "You don't have to do this," he said suddenly, his voice low, almost pleading. "We could turn around right now. You've made your peace in your own way. Maybe that's enough." I looked at him, really looked. He wasn't the same confident preacher who once filled a room with words about mercy and faith. His eyes were tired, rimmed with guilt that years hadn't softened. "Enough for you, maybe," I said, "but not for me. I'm done living halfway forgiven." He opened his mouth to argue but stopped. Instead, he nodded and whispered, "Then let's face the fire." We stepped out into the cool air. The gravel crunched under our shoes, every step sounding louder than it should have. The scent of roasted turkey, butter, and sage drifted from the house, warm and cruel. My stomach turned, not from hunger, but from memory. For a moment, I almost faltered, but then I saw the light flicker through the window, and I remembered her as a little girl waiting for me to call everyone to the table. I kept walking. When we reached the porch, I could hear voices clearly. Laughter, clinking glasses, the scrape of chairs. Someone was saying grace inside. For a brief moment, I wondered if I was too late. Maybe the meal had already begun. Maybe this was a mistake. Hassa. James looked at me. "Ruth," he said softly, "let me go in first. If she sees you with me at the door, it might—" "No," I interrupted. "We walk in together, like we should have years ago." He hesitated, then gave a slow nod. I could see his hand tremble as he reached for the doorknob. The chime jingled again, a delicate, trembling sound that almost broke my resolve. But I stood firm. The door creaked open, and the smell of Thanksgiving poured out. Sweet potatoes, gravy, laughter, and heat. The noise quieted almost instantly as faces turned toward us. My daughter froze mid-step, a serving dish in her hand. Her husband looked up from carving the turkey. Her mother-in-law's smile faded into confusion. "Mama?" she said, her voice thin and sharp with disbelief. Then her eyes flicked to the man beside me. "Pastor James?" The pie felt suddenly heavy in my hands. I set it down on the entry table. "We didn't come to stay long," I said gently. "Just long enough to say grace together." The room went still. Her husband's knife hovered midair. The children stared, and I could hear the clock ticking from the living room. Pastor James took a slow step forward, his head bowed slightly, his Bible pressed to his chest. "Grace," he said softly, "in truth." My daughter's face changed, confusion, anger, something else flickering behind her eyes. She set the dish down and crossed her arms. You shouldn't be here, she said coldly. Either of you. I felt my voice shake, but I met her gaze. Maybe not, but I'm here anyway, because you can't keep locking the door on the people who love you. Her lip trembled, just a little. You don't get to decide who I forgive. No, I said quietly, but you do get to hear why you should. Behind her, the candles flickered. Somewhere outside, thunder rumbled faintly, as if the storm had circled back to listen. Pastor James exhaled shakily, eyes glistening. May I pray before we go? He asked. My daughter didn't answer. She only stood there, rigid, trembling, torn between pride and pain. The rest of the family exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to sit or stand. And then, as if moved by some unseen current, she whispered, Fine, but make it quick. He stepped forward slowly, unfolding his hands. The house seemed to hold its breath, and as he began to pray, his voice broke on the first word. Lord. I closed my eyes, my heart pounding. Whatever came next, there would be no turning back. Grace was at the table now, and it demanded to be heard. The word Lord hung in the air like a tremor. Even the candles flickered, their flames bowing low as if the house itself were listening. Pastor James's voice quivered at first, but as he drew in a breath, something steadier rose from his chest. Not the smooth, practiced tone of a sermon, but the raw, trembling sound of a man confessing to heaven and earth at once. Lord, he began again, we thank you for this day, for food, for family, and for the mercy you give us, though we rarely deserve it. His fingers clenched around the Bible, knuckles white. But most of all, we thank you for truth, even when it hurts us. No one moved. I could feel my daughter's gaze burning against me, but I didn't look her way. I stood beside him, head bowed, heart thundering so loud I thought it might drown him out. He continued, voice breaking. There was a time I thought silence was mercy, that keeping secrets could protect others, but I've learned that silence can wound deeper than words. My daughter stiffened. What are you talking about? She whispered sharply, but he didn't stop. I told your daughter, he said, his voice cracking, to let go of her mother. I told her that distance would bring her peace. I did it believing it was right, but it wasn't righteousness that guided me. It was pride. Her husband shifted in his chair, eyes darting from him to me. The children looked confused, frightened even, as if the grown-ups were speaking in a language too heavy for them to understand. I lifted my eyes just enough to see my daughter's face. Tears had started to form, but she blinked them away quickly. Why? She asked, her voice trembling. Why would you say that to me? You were supposed to help us. Pastor James's voice softened, heavy with regret, because I was afraid that my own mistakes would come to light. I thought I was saving you from your mother's grief, from the pain that haunted her after your father died. But in truth, I was only saving myself from shame. The room felt smaller, air thinning as if every unspoken memory had come to stand between us. My hand shook, but I didn't interrupt him. This was his burden to lift. He swallowed hard and turned toward her fully. Your mother never meant to hold you back. Everything she did was out of love. But I twisted that love into something else, something that seemed dangerous to your independence. I convinced you she was the reason for your pain, when really it was me, my words, my pride, my cowardice. My daughter's face crumpled. You said she needed to repent, that she was wrong for questioning my choices. He nodded slowly. And I was wrong for saying it. She wasn't trying to control you, she was trying to protect you, from me, from the world, from the very thing I was supposed to shield you from. My throat tightened. I felt the sting of tears, but I didn't move closer. Not yet. The air between us wasn't ready for comfort. It needed the truth to settle first. Her husband stood, unsure whether to intervene. Maybe this isn't the time. My daughter cut him off. No, let him finish. Her voice cracked, but it carried a quiet strength, the same one she'd had since she was a girl. Pastor James bowed his head again. Forgive me, Lord, for the lies I told in the name of peace. Forgive me for taking a daughter's faith and using it to turn her against her own blood. And forgive me, Ruth, for standing in your home all those years ago and thinking I knew better than a mother's heart." He looked at me then, eyes wet, his face pale with exhaustion. I didn't answer. Words would have been too small. Instead, I reached out and laid my hand gently on his arm. It was my turn to speak. "Lord," I said softly, "we thank you for second chances, even when they come too late for perfect endings. We thank you for grace that's stubborn, that sits down uninvited and refuses to leave the table." My daughter's breath hitched. She took a step back, her eyes darting between us. The weight of years hung between mother and daughter. Every argument, every unanswered call, every holiday alone. The silence between us wasn't empty anymore. It was crowded with truth. Finally, she whispered, "You both took so much from me." "I know," I said. "And if I could give it back, I would. But the only thing I have left to offer is honesty. And love. The kind that stays even when it's not wanted." She looked down at the table. Her hands trembled as she brushed a tear from her cheek. Then, with a shaky breath, she said, "Sit down, Mama. You too, Pastor." The words were quiet, but they split something open in me, something old and aching that had waited 10 years to heal. Pastor James hesitated, glancing at me, but I was already moving toward the table. The others watched silently as I took the empty chair beside my daughter. It felt strange, sacred, fragile. No one spoke for a while. Then she reached for the serving spoon and whispered, "Let's eat before it gets cold." And as we passed the dishes, one by one, the clatter of silverware filled the air. Awkward, hesitant, but alive. Grace had done its work. And though no one said amen, I knew the prayer was still being answered. Dinner went on in uneasy silence. Forks scraped against plates, glasses clinked, but conversation never really began. The air was too heavy, thick with everything that had been said, and everything that hadn't. I chewed my food slowly, my eyes fixed on the plate, tasting nothing but the bitterness that still lingered between us. Across the table, Pastor James barely touched his meal. His hands trembled when he reached for his water glass, and his eyes stayed downcast, like a man waiting for judgment. My daughter picked at her food, her lips pressed tight, as though any word might shatter her restraint. Finally, she broke the silence. "Why now?" she asked quietly, her gaze fixed on him. "Why come here after all these years? Why not just stay gone?" He swallowed hard, his voice low. "Because you deserve to know the whole truth." She scoffed softly. "I think I've heard enough truth for one night." He shook his head slowly. "No, you've heard my confession, but not the reason behind it." He paused, his eyes lifting to meet hers. "I need to tell you what I did, not just to your mother, but to you." Her fork froze midair. The room went utterly still. He took a deep breath, his words trembling. "After your father's death, your mother came to me for counsel. She was drowning in grief, terrified she'd lose you to the same despair that had taken her husband. She blamed herself, thought she wasn't enough. I was supposed to help her, to help both of you heal." He closed his eyes. But instead, I let her lean on me too much. And when I felt her faith begin to depend on mine, I panicked. I pushed her away, and I used you to do it. I felt my stomach twist. I hadn't expected him to say it aloud. Not like that. His voice cracked under the weight of it. "I told you," he continued, looking at my daughter now, "that your mother was suffocating you because I needed her gone. I needed distance. Not because she was wrong, but because I was afraid of how much she trusted me." Tears welled in my daughter's eyes. "You made me hate her," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. "You made me believe she was sick, manipulative." He nodded slowly, tears slipping down his face. "And I've lived with that sin every day since. I thought I was saving myself from temptation, but all I did was destroy a bond that was sacred. I used the word to build walls instead of bridges." Her husband reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "You don't get to talk about sacred," she spat. "You took my faith and turned it into a weapon." The pastor bowed his head, silent tears dripping onto his plate. "I know. And there's no verse or prayer that can undo what I did. But I had to say it here, at this table, because lies lose their power in the light." The quiet stretched on until I couldn't stand it anymore. "He's not asking you to forgive him," I said softly. "Not yet. He's just asking you to hear him." She looked at me then, and the sight of her eyes, red, shining, and full of hurt, made my breath hitch. "And what about you, Mama? You knew something was wrong. You didn't stop him. I tried, I said, the words tasting like ash, but I didn't know how. I thought protecting your image of him, of the church, was the right thing. I was wrong too. The confession had ripples. Every truth pulled another from the deep, until the table between us became a mirror of our shared guilt. Pastor James's breathing grew uneven, like each word drained him. When I left the church, I thought I was walking toward peace, he murmured. But I've never slept through a night since. Every prayer I said felt hollow. Every sermon I tried to write turned into a plea for forgiveness. He wiped his eyes, his hand shaking. I came here because I couldn't preach grace anymore while hiding from the one person I wronged the most, my daughter's face softened just slightly, her lips parted, as if she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. The silence that followed wasn't empty this time. It was full of the weight of understanding beginning to settle. After a long moment, she whispered, "Do you believe God forgave you?" He looked at her with eyes both weary and hopeful. I think he did the moment I decided to stop lying. The candles had burned low by then, their wax pooling across the tablecloth. My daughter reached for her napkin, dabbed her eyes, and for the first time that night, she looked at both of us. Not as enemies, but as broken people trying to find their way back to grace. Her voice was quiet when she said, "You two should have told me sooner." "I know," I said, "but we're telling you now." She nodded, looking down at her plate. Then she reached out slowly and set her hand over mine. Her touch was tentative, unsure, but real. "I don't know if I can forgive either of you yet," she whispered, "but I can try." And in that moment, the years between us began to crumble. Not completely, not neatly, but enough to let the light in. For a moment, I thought that quiet, fragile and trembling, might last. But peace never comes without a cost. My daughter's husband cleared his throat, his fork clattering against the plate. "This is too much," he muttered. "You come into our home uninvited and turn dinner into confession." His voice rose sharp with discomfort. "Our children are here. They don't need to hear this." I looked at him, calm but firm. Children understand more than we think. They feel the truth even when they don't have words for it. He opened his mouth to argue, but my daughter raised a hand. "Enough," she said, her tone shaking but steady. "Let them speak. Let me breathe." Her husband fell silent, and Pastor James bowed his head again. The candlelight threw long shadows across his face, deepening the lines carved by guilt. He looked as if the years had finally caught up to him. I wanted to reach out, to tell him he'd done enough, but something in me knew the breaking wasn't over yet. My daughter turned to me suddenly, tears shining again. "Mama, all these years I thought you didn't fight for me, that you just let me go. Do you know how many nights I cried, thinking you stopped loving me?" Her voice cracked, the pain raw and unguarded. "You could have come. You could have called." I felt the words like blows. "I tried," I whispered. "Every letter I wrote came back unopened. Every message went unanswered. I thought you needed time. I thought space was love." Her eyes burned into mine. "No, Mama. Space isn't love. It's loneliness dressed up like mercy." My chest tightened, my hands gripping the edge of the table. I had waited 10 years to hear her say my name with that kind of fire, but now that it came, it tore something open inside me. "No," I said hoarsely. "I was wrong. I was a coward. I told myself I was respecting your wishes, but really, I was afraid of what you'd say if I showed up." The room trembled with silence. Even the children seemed to understand that something sacred and dangerous was happening. One of them, a little boy with her eyes, whispered, "Mommy, are you crying?" She turned to him, forcing a smile, wiping her face with shaking hands. "It's okay, baby," she murmured. "Mama's okay." But her voice cracked on the last word. Pastor James finally spoke, his tone quiet but firm. "No, she's not. None of us are, not yet." He stood, his hand trembling on the back of his chair. "I need to say one more thing." He turned toward her husband now, eyes steady despite the exhaustion. "You don't know me, but you've lived with the damage I helped cause. Every argument, every silence between mother and daughter. I planted that seed, and you watered it without knowing. I'm sorry for that too." Her husband blinked, unsure how to respond. For the first time, his anger faltered. He glanced at my daughter, then at me, then back at the pastor. "This isn't how I pictured Thanksgiving," he said softly. "But maybe it's what we needed." My daughter looked around the table, at her children, at her husband, at the two people who had failed her in the name of love. Then she stood up, pushing back her chair. "I can't do this," she said, her voice trembling. "I need to breathe." She walked toward the back door, her hands pressed to her mouth. I stood too. "Let me." "No," she said sharply without turning around. "Just give me a minute." She stepped out into the yard, the screen door creaking softly behind her. The room stayed silent. I watched her through the window, her figure outlined against the faint porch light, her shoulders shaking. My body moved before my mind could stop it. I followed her outside. The night was cold, the air still damp from earlier rain. She stood by the edge of the porch, hugging herself. The smell of wet earth filled the air. For a long time I didn't say a word. I just stood there beside her, close enough for her to feel me, far enough not to crowd her. After a while she spoke. "I don't know how to forgive you." I nodded, staring out into the dark. "You don't have to know. You just have to want to." Her voice cracked. "I don't even know if I want to." "I know," I said. "I didn't either, when your father died. Forgiveness felt like a language I'd forgotten." I took a breath. "But I learned that sometimes you forgive not because someone deserves it, but because you deserve peace." She turned to look at me then, her face streaked with tears, eyes full of that same fierce light she had as a little girl. "You always make it sound so simple." "It isn't," I said. "It's the hardest thing you'll ever do." "But grace isn't about easy. It's about truth." She looked away again, her chin trembling. "He hurt us both, Mama, and you let him." "I did," I admitted. "And I'll carry that till my last breath. But I'm here now and I won't leave again unless you tell me to." She didn't answer. The silence between us stretched, heavy but softer than before. Finally, she sighed and leaned against the porch railing. "You always were stubborn." I laughed quietly through tears. "You got that from me." She turned her head just enough to meet my eyes. "Don't think this fixes everything." "I don't," I said. "But maybe it's a start." And for the first time in 10 years, she didn't pull away when I reached for her hand. The porch light buzzed softly above us, casting a golden halo that flickered with every passing gust. My daughter's hand rested in mine, cool and trembling, but she didn't pull away. For the first time in years, there was no wall between us, only the quiet ache of two people remembering how to love each other again. We stood there for a long time, the sounds of the house muffled behind the door. Inside, I could hear faint voices, her husband comforting the children, Pastor James murmuring a prayer to himself. But out here, the night belonged to us. The rain had left everything glistening, the grass shining under the dim porch light like a field of tiny stars. "I used to stand here," I said softly, "on Thanksgiving mornings before the sun came up. I'd thank God for the noise, the mess, the chaos of it all. You used to wake up and sneak a taste of the pie before breakfast. Remember?" A weak laugh escaped her, half sob, half smile. "I remember you scolding me, then pretending not to notice when I did it again." I chuckled through tears. "That's what mothers do. We pretend not to notice so our children can think they're getting away with something." The sound of our laughter faded into the still air. She exhaled slowly, her breath a soft mist in the cold. "It's strange," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "You spend your life trying to build walls to protect yourself. And one dinner, one truth, and they all come crashing down." "Sometimes," I said, "the crash is the only way to clear space for what's real." She turned toward me, her eyes searching mine. "Do you think God can forgive him, Pastor James?" I looked up at the dark clouds shifting across the sky. Forgiveness isn't about what people deserve. It's about what we choose to release. I think God already has. The question is whether we can do the same. She was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "I'm not ready yet, but maybe one day." "That's enough," I said. "Grace doesn't rush." The door creaked open behind us. Pastor James stood there, his eyes red but calm, a faint smile trembling on his lips. "Dinner's getting cold," he said softly, "but the coffee's still hot." My daughter wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand. "We're coming," she said, her voice steadier now. He nodded, stepping back inside, leaving the door open for us. The warmth from the house spilled out, brushing against our faces like an invitation. We went in together. The children were already back at the table, their plates full, their eyes curious but gentle. Her husband gave me a small nod, hesitant but kind. The pie I'd brought sat untouched in the center of the table, its golden crust gleaming in the candlelight. My daughter took the knife, cut a slice, and placed it on a plate. She handed it to me first. "You always served everyone else before yourself," she said. "Tonight, you eat first." The words hit me like a blessing. My hand shook as I took the plate, the smell of cinnamon and butter flooding my senses. It wasn't just pie. It was a piece of the life we'd both lost and somehow found again. As we ate, the house began to breathe again. Soft conversation, small laughter, the quiet clinking of forks. It wasn't perfect, but it was whole in its own fragile way. Pastor James sat quietly at the end of the table, his hands folded, his eyes distant but peaceful. For the first time, he didn't look haunted. When the meal ended, my daughter stood and began to clear the table. I reached to help, but she shook her head. "Sit, Mama. Just sit." So I did. I watched her move around the kitchen, confident, graceful, alive. For years, I'd only seen her in memories, frozen in time. Now she was here, flesh and breath and forgiveness slowly taking shape. When she returned to the table, she looked at me with tired eyes and a faint smile. "I can't promise we'll be okay," she said, "but maybe we can start showing up again. For holidays, for each other." Tears blurred my vision. That's all I ever wanted. Pastor James stood then, his voice quiet but sure. "Before we leave," he said, "may I say one more grace?" My daughter hesitated, then nodded. "Go ahead." He bowed his head, and we followed. "Lord," he whispered, "thank you for food that fills us and truth that frees us. Thank you for forgiveness that comes late, but never too late. And thank you for letting us find our way back to the table." When we lifted our heads, the candles had burned low, their flames small but steady. My daughter reached for my hand again. I squeezed it gently and whispered, "Grace isn't something you earn, baby. It's something you share." And for the first time in 10 long years, I felt truly full. Not from the meal, but from the miracle of being welcomed again. Outside, the wind carried the last whispers of rain. Inside, the warmth lingered. Thanksgiving had come, cold and warm, broken and whole, just like grace itself.